Well, you know what I really like about, I call this the preamble to the Ten Commandments? I like the grace. I like the grace that is in this. God reminds the Israelites before he ever gives them the Ten Commandments and all the rules and all the things, he reminds them what he already did for them, right? What he already did for them. He delivered them out of bondage from Egypt. He doesn't start off with, okay, here's what you need to do. He begins with, I've already delivered you. You're already my people. I bore you up on eagle's wings, and I brought you to myself. Something he's already done. That's part of why I don't really jump on the whole bandwagon when people are like, oh, well, that's Old Testament. That's just all the rules, right? Jesus is where the grace comes in. Because we get a lot of grace, believe it or not, in the Old Testament. Because guess what? Same God, right? It's the same God. God's grace was present long before Jesus walked the earth. God was already out there delivering people from the things that held them captive. So the Israelites did not earn their deliverance, right? It was something God simply chose to do. God didn't tell Moses, go down to Egypt, see if they've been behaving themselves, see if they've been faithful enough, see if they've checked all the right theological boxes, and if they have, I'll consider getting them out of there. Instead, God hears their cries. He sees their suffering. He remembers the covenant that he made with their ancestors, and so he acts. Therefore, the Ten Commandments have always been the response to God's grace, not the way in which we earn it, right? In the same way, when we do the things that are commanded by Christ, which is just basically, the things he commands are taking the Ten Commandments and kind of smushing them into two, right? Love God, love your neighbor. God says essentially, you already belong to me, right? He says, you already belong to me. Now let me show you how people who have been set free should live. So it's not, you'll get in my good graces once you start doing these things. It's like, you're already mine, but this is how I want you to live now that I have done this for you. And maybe that's the best way to understand the commandments, that they're instructions for people who have already been freed from Egypt, right? They're about learning how to live free. Where we always see rules and things like that sometimes as restrictions, they're actually, this is how you live free. This is how you live when you're not in bondage. And it's important because Israel has spent generations learning how to live as slaves. 400 years is a long time. And they've spent that time knowing what it's like to be a slave. They've lived under Pharaoh's rules. Pharaoh has taught them this is what power looks like. Domination, the strong exploiting the weak. And Pharaoh taught them what human beings were worth. You were worth what you could produce. How many bricks can you make? How much labor can be extracted from your body? And when Pharaoh became frightened that the Israelites were becoming too numerous, he demonstrated just how little their lives were worth to him, and he began killing their sons. That's the world the Israelites have known for a long time. You can get the people out of Egypt. That happens a lot faster than getting the Egypt out of people, right? Getting those understandings, those ways of thinking changed and altered. So God doesn't simply liberate them from something. He has to liberate them for something, right? So he begins teaching them what they have been liberated for. Because God intends for them to live in a community that is unlike the communities around them. A community that doesn't operate according to Pharaoh's values. And that's where the commandments as a whole begin to make more sense, right? Don't worship other gods. Don't use God's name for your own purposes. Rest, which, I mean, if you spent 400 years, your people being slaves, think of how radical Sabbath must have sounded to former slaves. Because freedom that only belongs to you isn't the kind of freedom that God is creating. Because he says, rest not only for you, but for the foreigner, for your servants, for everybody, even your animals, get to rest. Don't murder, don't steal, don't betray your spouse, don't lie about your neighbor, don't become consumed with possessing what somebody else has. In other words, don't rebuild Egypt. Don't just go back and do things the way that they were done. Don't take the freedom I've given you and create another society where people dominate, where they exploit, where they deceive, where they consume, where they destroy one another. Because I've shown you now what liberation looks like. Now build a community where people can actually live those liberated lives. And here's how it starts. This is how it starts. So when Jesus does arrive on the scene, right, a few thousand years later, he isn't introducing us to a completely different God. The God revealed in Jesus is the God who has always heard the cries of people in bondage. The God who has always been in the business of liberation. The God who acts regardless of whether we have earned that action or not. Jesus embodies that grace everywhere he goes. He is that grace incarnate. He touches people before they've proven themselves worthy. He eats with people before they've cleaned up their lives. He forgives, he heals, he restores people to community. He breaks through the boundaries that have kept people isolated and excluded from the wider community. And ultimately, through the cross and the resurrection, God once again acts to liberate humanity from powers we cannot overcome on our own. In particular, the powers of sin and death themselves. Because once again, the grace comes first. There's grace for that, right? We don't earn resurrection. We don't earn forgiveness. We don't earn God's love. God acts, God delivers, and God brings us to God's self. And then comes the question of, okay, now how do we live into that reality? How do we respond? How do we order our lives in such a way that we honor that? That's why Christian ethics can never really begin with, here are the rules you have to follow so God will accept you. Christian ethics begin with, look what God has already done. Look at the grace you have received. Look at the freedom you have been given. And look at the love that has already claimed you. So, what does a life shaped by grace look like? How do people who have been forgiven treat one another? How do people who have been liberated respond when somebody else is in bondage? How do people who know that their worth doesn't depend on their productivity treat people the world considers useless? How do people who have received mercy respond to someone who needs mercy? Because the commandments don't start off with obedience. They begin with God's grace. The gospel doesn't begin with our obedience either. It begins with what God has done for us in Jesus Christ. I brought you out. That's where the story starts. I brought you out. I have delivered you. I have forgiven you. And everything we do after that is simply learning how to live like people who are already ready, free.